Is it possible to harness the power of hyperfixation? Stick around to find out. Hi friends, my name is Claire and this is my channel, Woodshed Theory. Here, I make content about what it is like to live as an adult on the autism spectrum and whatever else feels good to me. So if that sounds good to you, or if you're feeling particularly gracious today, and I hope that you are, please go ahead and click the subscribe button, ring the bell. I almost forgot to mention that I put out videos a few times a week, so click the like and the share. Help a girl out. Thank you. I appreciate it. Hyperfixation. What is it? Why is it? Who experiences it? Is it good? Is it bad? Can we use it? Is it possible to go through without burning out? Those are all things I wanted to address in today's video. Hyperfixation is something that affects most neurodivergent individuals. So I can say that autistic people experience hyperfixation, people with ADHD experience hyperfixation. It's pretty much part of the deal. So what is it? Hyperfixation is being fully immersed in something that interests you or a special interest. This comes at the exclusion of everything else. You may have seen somebody go through a period of hyperfixation or experienced it yourself. You're in the zone, you are getting things done. It's just you, your task, and yourself. As I mentioned, this is something that ASD and ADHD people, I won't say struggle, but experience on a semi-regular basis. It's different for everybody. We're all different, but we experience it. Hyperfixation can be positive and it can also be negative. What does a period of hyperfixation look like? Well, normally for me, it's getting so into a task that I cannot stop myself from finishing that task once I start. I will only focus on that task until the completion of said task. To an extent, I will forego doing anything else to be able to finish the task. There are so many great things about hyperfixation and also a lot of negatives. I've heard at least autistic people talk about both sides of that coin. First, the expense of everything else. It really means everything. People who are in hyperfixation mode may forget to eat, they may not sleep, they may forego their hygiene needs, they may miss meetings or appointments, they may ignore or be very short with the people around them, and chores, like keeping up with your everyday self. Don't expect dishes to get done during a period of hyperfixation. Of course, this is not always great on relationships. I've heard people talk about hyperfixation and how they react or respond to people during those periods of time. It is very difficult for a neurodiverse person to change directions in what they're doing. And if interrupted in the middle of their hyperfixation by someone, it can result in a negative reaction from the person who's experiencing the hyperfixation. So say I'm in hyperfixation and my spouse comes to me and tries to talk to me. I might be rude to him, I might be short with him, I might seem annoyed because he's pulling me off task. So relationships can really be affected negatively if you're not careful. What comes to mind is maybe making a t-shirt that says, "Sorry for what I said when I was hyperfixated," because you're not really considering those around you. Hyperfixation can also lead to internalized stress and distress for the neurodiverse person. If you've forgone your needs for an extended period of time, for example, you haven't eaten all day, or you haven't gone to sleep and you stayed up all night to work on a project, this can be very distressing, tired, hungry. When a person doesn't have their basic needs met, it's hard to function. So if you're in hyperfixation for a long period of time, you can become frustrated with yourself. Maybe you've started making mistakes and you can't stop until you finish. So making a mistake just adds more time. It can cause fatigue to be in hyperfixation. It can cause mental cloudiness. Again, if you're in a hyperfixation that's been 10 plus hours, you're no longer running at your full potential. You may get frustrated with yourself, upset about what you're doing, because sometimes it's working out perfectly and other times it's not. Oftentimes, these periods of hyperfixation can lead to what we like to call in autism a meltdown. So basically, we lose control of our emotions, of ourself. We have not met our sensory needs. We're overstimulated. And this can look a lot of different ways for different people. Some people kind of just shut off completely. Some people become nonverbal. Some people cry or scream. Everyone reacts differently to a meltdown. If it's for an extended period of time, burnout. You'll need time to recover from this period of hyperfixation. But just to talk about the good things, there are a lot of good things about hyperfixation. With hyperfixation, as a neurodivergent person, you can get more done and better and faster than perhaps somebody who is neurotypical. I'm not guaranteeing that, but I will say that from my experience and from others that I have experienced or spoken to, a period of hyperfixation usually results in a person being able to produce good work quickly. So maybe they're getting more done in a few hours than somebody might get done in a few weeks. This may sound a little bit impossible if you have not experienced it. However, it really is real. When we're interested in something, when we want to get something done, when we're hyperfixated, we are there. We are in the moment. Kind of like a fast-burning candle. I think that might be a good way to put it. Whereas a neurotypical person might be one of those 100-hour candles for emergencies, slowly burning down the wick. Neurodiverse people are a tea light. It burns hot, it burns fast, and then it's over. Another positive that I will talk about with hyperfixation is what I'll refer to as hyperfixation euphoria. Neurodivergent people enjoy being in hyperfixation, especially at the beginning, and of course at the end when you've done something, created something, produced something super amazing in a short period of time. There can be happy and good feelings that come along with hyperfixation. Another thing that's positive is many employers find this as a benefit for their company. So if you could get more done than another employee in a shorter amount of time, that saves them money, they're more productive. So that's another positive that I wanted to point out. Personally, I think that hyperfixation is a great thing for neurodiverse people. However, I can admit that there are some absolutely negative things about hyperfixation. I wanted to go over some strategies to avoid burnout, to avoid the need for recovery time, to help your relationships. This way, hyperfixation can just be a positive thing that we have as a neurodiverse community. I do want to mention that these are hard things, okay? Normally, when you go into hyperfixation, normally you don't have much control over the situation. It can be very spur of the moment to fall into a hyperfixation. Can you do a hyperfixation that is more planned out? Yes, I'll talk about that in a second. But the natural flow of hyperfixation, at least in my case and others that I've experienced, it can come out of a quick decision or feeling. A lot of times we don't stop to think about what's going on. It's also hard because ASD is a communication deficit. We communicate differently than other people. We communicate differently than those around us. The first thing that I think needs to be addressed when we're addressing hyperfixation, we need to be aware of our own personal signs of hyperfixation. We need to think about the times that we've been hyperfixated, reflect on them, and understand and identify areas of our hyperfixations that we can watch out for in future hyperfixation periods. Now, if possible, you will also want to give yourself a plan before starting a hyperfixation project. I know it's not always possible, but if you are able to acknowledge and understand that you're in hyperfixation, it's easier to put out a plan or talk yourself through it. You will definitely want to plan breaks, meals. Stopping points are very important with hyperfixations, or else you're just going to keep going until you burn yourself out. To help with this, you could set timers or alarms on your phone to give you a physical reminder that it's time to stop. It's okay to have that focus. It's okay to be hyperfixated. But if you aren't taking care of your needs and yourself, it's not going to end well for you. It can turn into a stressful thing. Another thing that I feel is important is to prep those around you for your periods of hyperfixation. Whoever is around, maybe this is at the workplace or at home with your significant other, your parents, siblings, etc. Have a discussion with them about hyperfixation and how to recognize it in you. Also have a discussion about the best way for them to bring up that you're in hyperfixation while you're in it. As I said before, sometimes when you're hyperfixated and somebody disturbs that, we can react in a rude way or not give that person time or react in an upset manner. So you're going to want to set some boundaries on how you want to be communicated with in that moment. And you do want to be communicated with, because if you can't spot yourself in hyperfixation, then maybe somebody else who cares about you can. This way, if you haven't caught it yourself and scheduled breaks and made sure that you're taking a step back to think about what you're doing, maybe somebody else will see it. Because I know that I'm not always the most self-aware person, and you're not always self-aware when you get into hyperfixation. That's everything I had for today. I'd love to hear in the comments if you've experienced periods of hyperfixation as a neurodivergent person. I'd also love to hear if you have a loved one or someone you care about and you've experienced their hyperfixation and what that's like in the comments. What are your tips and tricks for navigating hyperfixation in a more beneficial way to harness the power and do great things? Everyone would like to know, so make sure that you share it with us below. I hope that you have a great day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!